Hey, unruly subjects, it's Chenjerai, and I need your help to keep the show going strong. If you love what we do here, consider supporting us by joining our Patreon community. It's the best way to back the show, and you get some incredible benefits in return. Membership starts at just $5 a month. I mean, there's nothing that cheap, at least in New York. And you immediately get ad-free episodes and exclusive premium episodes. That includes interview outtakes and other extras you ain't gonna hear anywhere else. But that's not all. You can access the Unruly chat and polls. When we have a live event, you're gonna get the pre-sale tickets and the merch. Oh my God, the merch. You know the merch is gonna be fly. And you receive invitations to our Q&A live streams and, my favorite, our annual exclusive hangout with me, the producers, and a special guest. So yo, come on people, join the Unruly mob. Visit patreon.com/unrulysubjects. And thank you for making this show possible. Row Home Productions. Okay, everyone, we're gonna start. Yes, okay. Yes. As part of the president's deep commitment to communicating effectively with the American people, the administration is rolling out our new Tell It Like It Is initiative. And we've hired a new spokesperson who's going to address you today, Dontavius Coalface Hughes. Dontavius? What's up, y'all? You know what I mean? 6'7". Anyway, yeah, so what questions can I answer for y'all? Yes. Jim from Unwoke News. Dontavius, now that the Epstein files are out, what does the administration have to say about the president's relationship to Jeffrey Epstein? Come on, man. Come on. Y'all still on that, man? I mean, look, you got the files. What you want? You know what I mean? Listen, there's a lot of black people in those files. Some women, too. Should probably talk to them. All right, next question. This is Bill from The Rag. Dontavius, kind of referencing your last comment, so many of your policies target people of color. At this point, are y'all admitting that your policy is basically racist? Bill. No, Bill, that's the problem. Y'all want to call everything racist. Our administration does not endorse racism of any kind. We just trying to get as many people of color up out this country as we can, as fast as possible. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, and we think white people should stick together, but Nicki Minaj could stay. Yeah. Hi, Dontavius, it's Kristen from The Plug. With your election interference in Georgia and what the DOJ is doing with photo rolls, people have questions about the midterms. Are you planning on interfering in the midterm elections? Hey, Kristen, this is serious. We want to do everything possible to make sure that we have free and fair elections. And also, we don't see how any election where we lose could be free and fair. So we're going to proceed accordingly on that note. Thank you for the question. Who's next? This is Fred from Constitutional News. So much of what this administration is doing flies in the face of constitutional principles. Does this administration value the Constitution and democracy? Thanks for this question, Fred. Well, it's nuanced, right? Look, the Constitution is important, right? First of all, it's old. It goes back to the it's old, right? And I talk to the president about this all the time. And he says, listen, most of the founding fathers were good people, his kind of people, Some of them weren't so nice, he says. But, the president says that the problem with the Constitution is it was going in the right direction, but then the woke left and the media ruined it, They put some bad stuff in there. So we kind of fixing that now, you know what I mean? No, I'm not sure I know what you mean. Is the president going to be going to the Super Bowl? Now we talking, Fred, football. I knew it was some real journalists in here. The president's not sure if he's going to the Super Bowl, but we'll see. We are having our own halftime show. Maybe you heard about that. And we might have to start our own league, you know what I mean? Make football great again. MAFA or MAFBA, something like that, you know what I mean? But either way, it's going to be anti-woke football. Our own referee, no referees, actually. We don't want any referees, and only good buddies, the best buddies. That's all we want, the good buddies, you know what I mean? So anyway, this has been fun, y'all. I gotta go, I got a thing, but let's do this again soon. Peace. What up, y'all? Yes, Unruly Subjects is here again. Man, listen. Y'all thought we was stopping? We just getting warmed up, you know what I mean? For real. Hey, yo, one thing I gotta say right off the gate, shout out to the Patreon people. You know what I mean? To my Patreon supporters, you know what I'm saying? Like, a lot of people coming on our Patreon, you know what I'm saying? Both the paid and free subscribers. Like, these are people who, you know, y'all believed in us when we were just kind of starting out. We was like a little baby podcast, you know what I mean? And we kind of, you know, we getting our little walking legs. And man, I just appreciate y'all believing in us, supporting us early on, and checking in. And yeah, we want to hear from y'all as well. And by the way, let me just say that, y'all, you know, if you're listening to this and you're not a Patreon supporter of Unruly Subjects, come join us. You know what I mean? We want you. We want you to join us. Come be a part of what we're doing. You know what I mean? I want to remind everybody, look, we are making this show independently and for free. You know what I mean? To be honest, I'm going in debt making this show. Let's be honest. In the name of financial transparency. But yeah, if you want this to keep happening, and we need people to step up and support us on patreon.com/unrulysubjects or unrulysubjectspodcast.com, either way. And even if you can't afford to support us financially, you could join our Patreon for free. And that at least lets us kind of stay connected. So we want to see you there. We got chats and we'll have different content there that you can access. And yeah, man, you know what I mean? Come on, let's do that. Let's do this together. So for today's episode, we're going to talk about police. Those of you who listen to my show, Empire City, know I'm passionate about this. But before we get into today's main interview about the NYPD police oversight and the very sort of complex politics of what it means to sort of change in that space, I want to talk about something that might feel unrelated, but it actually isn't. One of the things that the whole conversation about policing does is it makes us think that public safety is basically all about policing, right? But of course, if you pay any attention to what actually harms people and what actually keeps people safe, you'll know that police don't have very much to do with that. And when you're living inside a collapsing system, whether it's like a hospital, a subway platform, or shelter, or whatever, you know, dealing with climate catastrophe, I mean, public safety means something entirely different. So one of the first things I want to share with you is a conversation I had with a nurse named Kim Mullen. She's a nurse at Kaiser Permanente out in Southern California. And she's one of the labor leaders who's on the front lines, both in her hospital, but also at this strike, which is still going on. And when we talked, she laid out really plainly what staffing shortages actually look like from the inside, because this is one of their big demands, right? Like staffing shortages. And she talks about days where there's just like no magic fix, right? It's just that nurses and healthcare workers just have to work harder. And so when nurses go on strike, right, it's easy for management or politicians or, you know, certain news outlets to turn it into a really narrow story about pay or, you know, inconvenience or something. But Kim really takes us into the real reality of what understaffing does. And it doesn't just exhaust workers. It actually changes what care is, right? It changes what patients get. And it changes whether people can make it through their shift safely. So I'm going to play you a short clip from that conversation. The full interview is up on our Patreon. And I just wanted to make the whole thing available for people because it really is all about not just like labor and healthcare, but what happens when a hospital has to run on scarcity.
There's a consequence to the community. There's consequences to our patients. There's consequences to the staff. And ultimately, there will be consequences to the company itself unless somebody takes a stand. The consequences to our patients essentially is that they don't get the care that they deserve. It's not a high quality care. They will get upset with the nurses. We have had violent events happen. We have had threats. We have had anger. And the reality is that we are the ones that are trying to make do with what we have. Our whole entire life, our whole entire goal, our whole entire calling was taking care of people and loving people. It's a special thing to be a nurse. We give our whole heart and soul into it. And what happens is we will try to make it work even though we don't have what we need to make it work. We will try to make it work. And the reality is with that, many times the staff myself suffer. I know I've gone long periods of time having to go to the bathroom and not going. I've gone long periods of time missing a break just so maybe I can give my patient 5 more minutes just to cover up the inadequate resources that we have. But the patients suffer because more injuries happen, more complaints happen, dissatisfaction happens, anger happens from them. And I would be angry too. It affects our communities because without enough access, our community has to wait longer to get care. If you have to wait longer to get care, then you're going to end up being more sick by the time you do get care. And even at that, the staff, the whole time trying to hold it together, when we don't have enough to give the care that we want to give and we can give, we just don't have the resources. That's when we talk about moral injury. And moral injury is what's happening to our frontline nurses now. And it's devastating and it is sweeping the nation. And you could see nurses across the country finally standing up for these patients because we can only make it work for so long on our backs. And when making us do too much with too little for too long, there comes a time where enough is enough. We are on strike for our patients so that they get the care they deserve.
Mm-hmm.
But we are also on strike for one another so that we don't continue to suffer this moral injury day in and day out of going home knowing you didn't do a good job. Every day you go home knowing that you didn't do a good job and you couldn't do a good job. And it's not because you're not an exceptional worker. It's because you're not given what you need to do a good job and feel proud of your work. And then the third part of it, landing on the company itself, part of us is on, like we are on strike to actually save the company. They're going down the wrong path. And they do not know that they're going on the wrong path because the people making these decisions are too far from the bedside. And it's almost like we have to stand up to save them from themselves.
Yeah, y'all. So that was Kim Mullen. You know what I'm saying? Nurse leader, labor leader, really a clear communicator about what's going on and what's at stake. And y'all definitely want to check the full interview on Patreon because we're going to get into, all kinds of things. Like I ask her how nurses are supposed to respond if ICE shows up at the hospital. She talks about what victory in this current strike would look like. And she gets into the money issues, all kinds of stuff. So yeah, check that out. Patreon.com/unrulysubjects or unrulysubjectspodcast.com, either way. And listen, I'm starting with this conversation about healthcare, staffing, and all those kinds of things on purpose. Because when we talk about police, we're usually told this is the core institution that stands between us and chaos. But in real life, safety is produced or destroyed by a whole ecosystem, labor conditions, housing conditions, mental health infrastructure. So listen, y'all, a while back, I made a podcast called Empire City, the untold origin story of the NYPD. It's an 8-part limited series that tells you the origin story of the NYPD, which is one of the oldest police forces in the country. And I did that because I really wanted to look at what the history teaches us about the function of this institution, efforts to reform it. And, it's pretty damning. I mean, I think it's historically accurate, right? I mean, we got all the receipts and, facts. But at the same time, it's damning, right? I mean, it shows you what has happened and what hasn't happened over the last 200 years. And so people have engaged with it. Even police officers themselves have said they really have learned a lot from it. But I've also got consistent piece of feedback from some listeners who basically said, look, I get the history and I get some of these larger arguments you're making, but what can actually be changed in the NYPD right now, in the world we're in right now, right? And I mean, some people who are asking this are down for more dramatic revolutionary change, but when they hear some of the things that, organizers will say, to them, it doesn't feel realistic. So it's a real question, but it's also kind of a trap door though, right? Because what the history shows is that a lot of these efforts at tinkering with the NYPD or tinkering with police reform, really becomes a substitute for real power building. Either way, the NYPD exists right now. It's still out there doing work for better or worse. And even if you believe the institution is fundamentally doing what it was designed to do, it's still worth understanding some of those details that I think some people who think like me may not be that interested in, right? Like the actual machinery, oversight, discipline, unions, commissioners, and the sort of political choke points where something could actually move. And this is especially important right now because New York is in a strange moment. We have a new mayor, Zohran Mamdani, and his political roots and public commitments have included really serious criticism of police. As a candidate, he talked about curbing the police commissioner's power, especially the commissioner's power to block the efforts of the CCRB. At the same time, the biggest headline in the Mamdani and policing story so far has been his relationship with the current commissioner, Jessica Tisch, and specifically his decision to keep her on. I mean, he had initially said that he was going to, remove the police commissioner. So I think that really disappointed a lot of people. Now, he did reorganize it so that she reports to the deputy mayor. And some people saw that as a demotion. But later, Mamdani did clarify that Tisch will report to him. And this is not really a demotion. And I guess, maybe the Mamdani administration look, I get why maybe they're trying to avoid a big fight on public safety, because public safety is certainly one of the things that Mamdani's opponents would love for him to get into a mess over. And maybe they feel like Tisch isn't the worst. Some people have said that Tisch is, certainly better and less corrupt than the previous police commissioners. But, I mean, even if she is better, the structure is still the structure. And let me give you one real clear example. For more than a decade, the police commissioner has had the right to basically dismiss substantiated cases by the Civilian Complaint Review Board, the CCRB. The CCRB is where you go if, police beat you up or whatever, you have a complaint, you go there. And this is a review board that will investigate all of those misconduct claims. But the problem is that even when they go through the investigation and they say this is substantiated, the police commissioner can still just dismiss it and not deal with any of their recommendations. Now, Gothamist reports that Tisch used that power, which is called retention power. She used it 25 times, which is better than Edward Caban, who they say blocked 82 cases in 14 months. But, in the end of the day, they're still blocking substantiated cases that were the result of, like an investigation. You know what I'm saying? So that's an interesting just example of the fact that we got to do some deep structural rethinking if you really want to get at this thing. And then there's like the whole sort of crisis management side of this, which now the Mamdani administration has to deal with, right? Recently, there was a police shooting in Queens involving a young man whose family called for help during emotional distress because they knew he was struggling mentally. And the police shot the man, Mamdani said his administration would release body camera footage and pointed back to his proposal for a Department of Community Safety built around prevention, sustained care, and crisis response. So police aren't the only default responders to situations, which, to be honest, they're just not prepared for, right? And, that's an example of the public-facing political terrain, right? How do you deal with these shootings? How do you deal with messaging? A struggle over whether New York can actually build alternatives in a way that addresses problems fast enough. And one example of that is that Mamdani has planned to disband something called the Strategic Response Group. This is like part of the police, sort of a specific group of police that was created in 2015 as like an emergency unit. But basically it's used to police protests. It has been infamous for tactics like kettling with hundreds of people arrested. I mean, I personally have been arrested by the Strategic Response Group when they came to NYU. And I've also heard that this is a place where they dump cops who have problems in other assignments, but that's something that people can look up. I mean, we'll see what happens. So far, Mamdani is saying that this is something he's going to be committed to. But I think that in the background of all that, there is something that's a little bit less flashy, but really important, right? And that's the internal NYPD discipline system and this sort of tug of war about what police oversight really looks like. So today's main interview is with Mac Muir. He's a former investigator with New York's Civilian Complaint Review Board and someone who also ran civilian oversight in Oakland. And I want to be upfront. Like, some of what Mac argues for is hard for me because my instincts after doing Empire City and everything I've lived through and studied is we are not going to engineer our way out of these policing issues with just like better procedures, right? My instincts are about power, what policing is, what it protects, and why these scandals are actually features, not glitches, right? And you'll hear me say that directly in the conversation. My argument is that the NYPD has a pattern of major investigations roughly every decade since they started. Actually, even before the modern NYPD was even formed, before they were a modern department, there was already examples and complaints about corruption, revealing really deep harm and questions about whether this institution is reformable. But here's why I think Mac Muir is really important to listen to. He's not doing PR. I don't think he's out here really trying to do Copaganda. And he's not pretending oversight is easy, but he is talking about the actual mechanics, right? The points where the system narrows accountability, what reforms would look like if you were trying to push it as far as it can go. And he breaks down what the CCRB can and can't investigate, how limited its jurisdiction is, the categories it covers, all those things, right? And I think that, look, these are like some of the practical things that if you want to deal with things as they are now, he's going to get into, how you can push that pretty far. And he's doing that as someone who's participated both in the New York CCRB, but more importantly in Oakland CCRB, which has far more robust powers than New York does, even though obviously Oakland has not solved the problem of policing. So we're going to be talking about police a lot on this show with different people, some of whom really disagree with Mac. So I'm really interested to hear what you think. Coming up after the break, Mac Muir. This episode of Unruly Subjects is brought to you by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for listeners like you. And one that I know you're going to feel is The Extended Universe, How Disney Killed the Movies and Took Over the World by Vicky Osterweil. A provocative history of Disney's rise to cultural dominance, The Extended Universe pulls skeletons from the corporate closet to decode the political messages hidden in all your favorite childhood movies. In The Extended Universe, Vicky Osterweil takes us on a quest to discover how Disney's Imagineers have made it impossible to reflect on the wonders of growing up without thinking of Disney's movies, amusement parks, and merchandising. Drawing on extensive interviews with filmmakers, screenwriters, union organizers, and Disney adults alike, Osterweil unearths reactionary political commitments and maleficent legal maneuvers so cartoonishly evil they would make one of Walt's own animated villains blush. As Natasha Leonard puts it, Osterweil is the brilliant, generous, and revolutionary guide we need to rethink cultural production today and kill the mouse inside our heads. Find The Extended Universe at haymarketbooks.org, where all hardcover books are 10% off every day. Unruly Subjects is supported by listeners just like you. Join us at patreon.com/unrulysubjects. Unruly Subjects. I am so excited. This is an interview I've been waiting for months, years. We have in the building Mac Muir. All right. By way of introduction, Mac Muir is one of the leading thinkers and sort of organizers and, people really having an impact on the issues of police accountability and oversight. He was former executive director of the Community Police Review Agency in Oakland and was a supervising investigator in the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board right here in New York. And I would say, he's an author, he's written a really important book called Cop, along with Greg Finch, Breaking the Fixed System of American Policing. Everybody needs to read this book. When you're talking about a book that just really has kind of like all the receipts. Like they're able to ground everything they're saying in so much experience. This book really is crucial and has helped me to understand things with a lot more precision. And I just would also say Mac is somebody who really just helps me understand what's going on right now. Y'all know I live in a historical world, and I also live in a world where I'm trying to think about public safety in terms of our revolutionary horizons and where the kind of world we ultimately can get to. But to get to that world, we got to struggle through the conditions we're in right now. And Mac is really one of the best people on that topic. So thank you for coming. You know what I'm saying?
Amazing, Chenjerai. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really glad we were able to get this together.
All right. We're here in New York City, and where we have a new mayor.
Yeah.
And where we also have, one of the largest police departments in the world. I think, is it the largest in the country?
It's the largest in the country by a wide margin.
Certainly the NYPD stays in the headlines with all kinds of issues. How should we understand this organization?
Well, I'll start by saying that's kind of like asking, how do you understand the Vatican, right? There's a complicated way to approach it. It's the largest police department in the U.S., unless you're counting ICE right now. And you find that it's a dynamic organization with a lot of different things going on. But the forefront of the conversation right now is Zohran Mamdani's decision to retain Jessica Tisch, who was the commissioner under Eric Adams. And it's an unlikely pairing. I think it's really interesting to see all the different factors of politics in New York lead to them coming together. And for the time being, her supporting the idea of him creating the Department of Community Safety, which would be the largest alternate to law enforcement response system in the United States, from what I understand. And on top of that, you've got a model which could pair violence prevention systems that are generally handled by nonprofits and pair that with alternate response of having social workers or some sort of alternative respond to incidents with folks dealing with mental illnesses. And that's really at the forefront this week, where an officer shot and killed somebody in a hospital who was holding somebody at knife point or was with a piece of porcelain and threatening to kill them. The irony of that situation is they found out that person who was shot and killed was actually a former member of the NYPD.
Wow.
Right? There's layers to this. And so I think it speaks to what we talk about in the book about the mental health issues that plague officers, whether that's out loud or quietly. And there's been some debate about Mayor Mamdani's response to that and the timeliness of that. But at the same time, we're seeing a key issue, this alternate response, shaping the future of New York politics, and it's going to be at the forefront of the conversation.
Absolutely. And one thing we can come back to is, you make some very concrete proposals in your book. And one of them, I think, has to do with thinking about developing agencies other than the police who can participate in violence reduction. And so I'm interested later to come back to how you see this effort in relation to that. But my understanding at one point was that, just slowing down a little bit, the NYPD had, the last count I saw was like 30, people throw around the term 36,000 officers. Is that? Yeah,
I believe it's between 34 and 35 right now. It's ranged up from 30 to 38 at various times in recent history.
Right. And then they're broken into various departments across the city.
Yeah,
right?
So there's 77 precincts. Okay. And then you've got all these different subdivisions that overlap with those precincts.
All right.
And so for every one of those 77 precincts, you've got a commanding officer managing the precincts. You've got all these layers of bureaucracy above that. And we delve into the book of understanding the NYPD is understanding how compartmentalized it is and what a complex organization it is as well. And that I remember really well, an officer once said that if he, who was working in Brooklyn at the time, went to Queens the next day and made an arrest, he wouldn't know how to do it because the systems are so different.
Wow.
And that's something that's pretty stunning from the layperson's perspective, where you're like, oh, this is a big, complex bureaucracy, and in some ways it's as messy on the inside as it looks on the outside. But I think the exciting juncture we have right now with the change in leadership in the department from a year ago is that there's been some serious anti-corruption efforts, but also whistleblowers have come out during the Adams administration, and I think there's some unfinished business on that end as well.
Okay, so you describe, so you got this massive institution, 77 precincts.
Hundreds of other subdivisions.
All under the commissioner,
Correct.
Jessica Tisch. And then there's other parts, right? Like at one point in the book, you make the distinction between, you say one thing people need to understand is the difference between police departments, police officers, and then the police union. Could you talk about each of those, how they differ, and why it's important to understand them differently?
Yeah, so I guess I'll branch that into four. So you have the police department itself, which is its own self-perpetuating institution, which happens for any government bureaucracy. It sort of, by its own nature and its own interests, tends to grow. Right, and having run a government agency, I know that feeling quite well. And then you have the police leadership. So you have Jessica Tisch, you have the new chiefs that she has put into place post Eric Adams scandals, with a vision for having a much better run, efficient, and ideally anti-corruption focused bureaucracy. And police leaders tend to have just a different set of incentives than the rank and file. And when we say rank and file, that means the cops that you actually see out on the street in general. Mm-hmm. So those are going to be the folks who are actually responding to calls as opposed to their managers. And you can think of this from union politics or just any sort of corporate structure, right? You've got the folks in the offices in the ivory tower, as the rank and file would put it. And then you've got the folks who are doing the work, who are actually experiencing, I would say, the most direct psychological challenges that come with policing. They're the ones who see the blood and the guts, right, and who are looking folks in the eyes. And then separately, you have the police union. So in most states, you're going to have police officers be unionized. And the union has a separate set of interests, as with any union, where they're looking at dollars and cents. And in New York, what is interesting and what I think is different is because this is such a major media market, the union's very present in the media, talking about the conditions of police officers. And I think as folks who are looking to increase accountability, to increase constitutional policing, it can be easy to go, hey, they're out in the media defending this officer who shouldn't be defended, or taking this strong stance in a way that seems anti-transparency. But a lot of that ties into their interest in union negotiations. And so I tend to not look at that through such a critical sort of moral lens, but saying they're doing their job and advocating for their people and trying to make sure that they're better paid and have better work conditions. But what's going on now, and I think that what makes Zohran Mamdani a different sort of politician, is he seemed to be very intentional about talking to the officers on the street and voicing that when he talks about policing issues, saying, I'm speaking to cops, I'm trying to hear from them, because I do think in my experience, having investigated police misconduct, having spoken with so many members of law enforcement, having developed really meaningful friendships with folks in law enforcement, it is so important to be talking to the folks who are actually doing the work. And I think as a politician, it can often be compelling to just talk to the police leadership.
I see what you're saying.
To hear from them, and they're trying to manage an organization. Right. That's a different thing than talking to folks who are dealing with the psychological toll that comes with policing. And I think that's also where we differentiate ourselves in the way we view this, where there is a serious psychological toll to policing. It's a little different than the one that we're advertising. It's not just the dangerous profession at all times. It's that the slow moments are tough. The things that you take home with you are tough. And you see that through studies on whether it's abuse in the home, whether you see that on suicides by officers. Right.
Nobody, I mean, these are people who are facing real challenges with mental health. And I think in that regard, I mean, listen, I think what the distinction you made is important, because police try to use that to paint themselves as the victims of a war on cops, or as the victims of all these other things, and to kind of present their job, I think, as more dangerous than it is. But that doesn't mean that we can acknowledge that first responders and, I mean, the reality of it is that even I think from an abolitionist perspective, where you say, for somehow you've applied policing to all these social problems where you don't necessarily, policing isn't really the solution. I think even in that, there has to be the recognition that now you're plunging these people who are unprepared into all these different kinds of social situations, right? And so I think that there's some overlap there. But I do want to come back to the point about police unions and just say, I hear what you're saying. I'm trying to take in what you're saying about, rather than just to look cynically at the police union as an organization that's just here to lie and say terrible, horrible, basically like fascist shit, which is, to me, I think there's a lot of empirical evidence of that example. You're saying, but there's a reason why they're doing this, because they're also trying to look out for the sort of negotiating rights of their job rights and working conditions. But I mean, like I talked to somebody from the police union, and he was arguing. I have this recorded, by the way. He was arguing why it was important for officers to be able to view body cam footage after an incident before anybody else could really see that footage.
Yeah, and which I strongly disagree with, by the way.
Okay.
So I think that, and you'll find in most police unions, so they have elections.
Right.
And so those become political competitions, and usually the folks who become police union leaders are the most brash folks who are willing to tell it like it is, as Trump might say.
Right.
And so I think you tend to see that
going
the leader,
all the way back to people like John Cassess in the early, right.
Yeah, you'll have folks who are willing to push it in terms of the reasonability of arguments, and then rest back when they go to the negotiating table and use that as negotiating leverage. But these are also just that's the nature of those elections. I think that my experience has been the average officer in the police department has a much more wide set of political values. That you're going to tend to have the most conservative folks leading the police unions, but there are, of course, and the folks who come out publicly saying, hey, we support the Department of Community Safety in New York. And I think that my experience has been there's major fissures in law enforcement. And so the head of the police union might represent one perspective, but even in dealing with that specific issue, where I've had those debates with folks in law enforcement, other cops have come to me and been like, yeah, I know, I'm going to just tell the truth when I get interviewed, right?
I think that's real important because to me, like, look, I know there's people who are like, all these distinction with one cop and the cop boss and with the manager and that doesn't matter because in the end, this is like a sort of oppressive colonial force. And again, having made Empire City, I get that. But I just think that, like, you know, just in the same way that I think it's important to examine some of the rifts that are happening now in the larger conservative party, I think it's important to pay attention to those because in there might be opportunities to move certain things in a better direction. I mean, you have to attend to these, and I think that in that regard it does matter. And I in that regard I really do appreciate the work of that you're doing and other folks who are attending to those specifics. While I do think that there is time to sort of step back and just acknowledge the function of this institution. I think, by the way, your book does a great job of at least grounding whatever we're going to say about the institution in some real history. So just for folks who are listening, just to let you know, there's chapters on slave patrols. There's history in the book. It starts out with a great timeline. Like, the book doesn't shy away from that. So usually when we have a conversation like this, we make people wait to the end before we get the solution. So you're sitting there listening for hours. I want to get to the solutions right off the gate, and then we can come back and talk about some of your experiences and why your experiences, I mean, like listening to what you've been through and why you have arrived at these is like, oh, wow, okay, this is a person who knows what they're talking about. But before we even get into these solutions, I just want to give you a chance to respond to two critiques. First, broadly, police reform. Mm-hmm. I mean, I kind of make the argument in Empire City that 180 years of the NYPD demonstrates that this institution is not really reformable because at minimum every 10 years, there's a major investigation that reveals really harmful practice that was occurring between those 10 years. And this is what the Mullen Commission concluded, right? Mm-hmm. It wasn't just me. Leslie Kornfeld said this. She was like, every 10 years going back to the Lexo, you know what I'm saying? So there are people who therefore say our energy needs to be on something else, but the idea of police reform is basically just a way to strengthen the worst practices of what's happening. Now, how do you respond to that?
So I grew up in Oakland, California. I studied the history of the Black Panther Party. I studied the history of the Oakland Police Department and eventually got to be executive director of the police oversight agency there. One of the only ones in the country with discipline authority, which meant that when an officer needed to be fired, they were. Now, there's a years-long appeals process that sometimes waters that down, but it did have real impact in the department and on the streets because people understood that. And officers understood if you lie, there's going to be discipline, there's going to be accountability for that, and that's going to be looked at by whether it was the oversight entity, whether it was the federal monitor. There were a lot of eyes on this because there had been a group of officers about 25 years ago who were planting drugs on folks at wide scale and beating them up. the sergeant from that unit remains on the FBI's most wanted list.
Wow.
So there's a real terrible history in that city when it comes to policing and a lot of harm. When they created this more powerful police oversight entity, they found that civil lawsuit payouts against the city, or there's suits against the city, so folks get beat up by the police and then they ask for X number of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, as happens in New York, where there's about, I believe, $200 million a year spent on that.
Is that coming out of taxpayers' money?
Oh, yeah. And it depends on city to city, but ultimately it's taxpayer. There's insurance. There's complex processes that differ from place to place. But you saw that number collapse in Oakland when they had this stronger, really genuine accountability system. And so what is a civil lawsuit payout? It's a measurement of harm, right? When you're actually doing the calculation, you're saying how many broken bones were there? What is the long-term impact of this? So when I see civil lawsuit payouts go from $55 million to $5 million, I'm saying that's a community that's being less harmed. And so however you view the longer-term trajectory, there are real outcomes that are creating conditions for less harm that come from real police accountability that is driven by community. And in some cases, driven by officers who understand that it is a better working environment to be in when you have real accountability, so you don't have to be looking out over your shoulder at somebody who's committing misconduct and getting away with it and wondering what to do, which is stressful. And I've talked to officers have reached out to me since this book was published and talked about that and have thanked me and Greg for putting that together, because we do view it from the officer's perspective wherever we can. And I think there's a lot more mutual interest than one thinks at the first glance. And that's one of the reasons that I think Zora Mamdani got elected. This Department of Community Safety, this alternate response, not just a progressive idea. I think there are a lot of cops who you see on their podcast saying, I don't want to be doing that. So that's an example of mutual interest. And there's trust that needs to be built into that.
I've never asked to listen to a cop podcast before, but if you could send me those,
oh my goodness, I'd love to hear I'm hooked on it.
Just but no, I hear what you're saying, which is like, look, there are people who were essentially like, there was harm that was reduced, right? There was real harm, measurable harm reduction, and that matters, is what I hear you saying. Now, one branch of the policing that we did not discuss, for example, with NYPD, is the PR branch of it, which I think at present is gigantic, right? You know, I've heard the number 86 thrown around. I don't know exactly where it is. These are probably full-time people. I can't even imagine what 86 full-time PR people would do, for any organization. But what do you think about this storytelling function as part of what makes it hard, or as an issue of police reform?
Yeah, so I'm going to get a little meta with you.
Yeah.
So we talk in the book about the arc of even the term tough on crime, and there is an issue going on in American politics right now.
Right. When you say the arc, meaning you talk about the history of that term.
Yeah, and I'm going back to the intersection with what does it mean to be tough on crime? Does it mean to beat up black people? Does it mean to keep them in their place? Does it mean a metaphor for we're going to fight crime?
Right.
And you see that used in intentionally racialized pro-segregation ways. You see that used in more nuanced ways. Richard Nixon tried to sort of square the two. That evolves. And certainly Trump's taken advantage of rhetoric parallel to that. I think that I view police departments as reflections of our democracy and our society. And so, and I would say that they are often driven by political interests. And what we have in the broader American discourse is a gap between what real safety is and what our perception of public safety is. And when you see politicians talking about public safety right now, they're not necessarily talking about what makes us safer. They're saying people don't feel safe. I think that there's a really important conversation that America is still not quite having on what's more important, how I feel about safety or what's literally going on. And that's how we go into crime stats. That's how we go into journalistic coverage of crime, because one great study showed the perception of crime in your community, and this is pre-social media, was directly correlated to the headlines in your area, in the newspapers. That whether or not you felt safe was just the raw number of headlines that said things that seemed unsafe.
All right, thank you. I love this answer, and I think it sounds like there's basically a lot of overlap, but I appreciate what you are bringing to it. You make some proposals in the book, and let's just do this. Let's start out. Let's just run down quickly, and you can give a sentence on each one. Number one, police women. What do you got to say?
Yeah, so it's about 18% of law enforcement in the U.S. Are women. And you find that the few studies that have been conducted on women in policing is that they use less force, that wildly male officers use less force in the presence of female officers, and that they're also, they appear to be disruptors of networks that end up becoming sort of rogue criminal networks within police departments. And so it's not the solution, but I think it's a really important harm reduction solution, and that if you look at any other profession and said there's only 18% of folks are women, you would ask yourself, what's really going on here? And so I think it is very important when you look at the investigation of sex crimes, when you look at domestic violence investigations, that more women be in police departments. I think that there's an aim for it to be 30% across the country. That's the pledge that a lot of law enforcement agencies are making, but you'd hope that there's real gender parity. And I think the studies have shown that there are real outcomes from that. So it's incremental, most definitely, if you're looking for broader systemic reform, but it's something that's really tangible, and it's something that every politician can be pledging to make happen, and that's in concert with creating environments in police departments that are actually healthy for folks to work in. It's a longer conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky for me because on the one hand, the ideas about diversity in policing as a thing that has helped is something that I challenge, for example, in Empire City. And I know I've also seen some data that challenges that. One particular kind of data that challenges diversity broadly is if you look at the New York record, if you look at the 50A or database and just sort by, the worst kind of conduct, and you're going to see all kinds of folks doing it. Now,
men of any race.
Ethnicity, right.
Yeah, race and ethnicity tend to commit misconduct at the same rates.
Right. And I think the whole way diversity is used is something that can be pretty insidious in terms of the way the gender is used. Are going to sort of we're going to do women's leadership in policing, but we're not going to address other issues. That said, I do find it interesting. I mean, men have real issues. I mean,
we know this, right? Groups of men.
Yeah.
That's really the defining feature that psychologists. Actually, a former NYPD lieutenant did a psychological study after getting his PhD and found that groups of men alone are the most likely to be violent. Right.
That's it.
And so I think there's a different solution for every moment.
Right.
And the reason initially that there was such a push for there to be more black officers, and I'm talking in the 60s,
right,
was the idea that a black person could have power over a white person in a law enforcement action was really important to activists. There's a different moment, right? It's not, and that was a boundary to push, that a white person could be pulled over by a black person.
Right.
Right? We're living in an entirely different era, and so there's a different conversation, a different solution to be had.
It turned out that didn't turn into safety for the masses of black people or anybody else. But okay, violence reduction agencies. What's this about, quickly?
So I would just pair that to Zoran Mamdani's proposal for Department of Community Safety, having alternate response for mental health situations, and then also having more complex violence reduction work that's done prior to crimes being committed, so that you're getting involved in communities, and that's been expanded mostly on the West Coast, but in Newark and Baltimore, you've seen really great outcomes from folks getting into the community and working to prevent violence before it happens from a non-law enforcement perspective.
All right. Civilianize internal affairs. We kind of talked about this a little bit.
Well, so that's the current plan in Oakland, is that there will be a transfer of the responsibilities of internal affairs to the Civilian Oversight Agency. They have the discipline authority. There's a question about resourcing, which is a question in every single city. But Certainly in some cities, I think that that's a reasonable end goal, is that if you have a robust internal civilian oversight agency with checks on its power and checks on the quality of its investigations, those should be the ones doing the work, and it's also cheaper for the taxpayers every time. You want to pay a sergeant $200,000 to do an internal affairs investigation, or a civilian $100,000 to do it.
Right.
It is meaningful, and if the quality is better at $100,000, I think it's cut and dry.
Than paying somebody twice that much to investigate ourselves.
Who's trained to go out onto the street, right?
Right.
So it's just a resource allocation question, and I think that you want checks on that. You want to make sure that you don't have folks conducting investigations on the civilian side being biased in favor of one party or the other. But as long as you have checks on that throughout, same should be true for internal affairs, then I think you've got a best case scenario in a lot of places.
Tear down the blue wall. What does this mean?
So this speaks more broadly to transparency issues around policing. Like, I would say that many of the records that are in this book were obtained via 50A. And we were only able to write this because Civil Rights Law 50A that was rescinded in 2020, right after the murder of George Floyd, to make it so folks could see the disciplinary proceedings against members of the NYPD and across New York State.
So because of this database, anybody listening, can now go look up records of misconduct.
I could look up cases I investigated, right? It's sitting right there online, and I think that's meaningful, and it also provides a very interesting lens if you actually go through and read the reports. In California, if I were to write this book, I'd go to jail, right?
Wow.
Right, it's a misdemeanor. And I am not legally allowed to discuss any of the specifics of the cases that I handled or investigated unless they are otherwise out in the public record. And there's a disclosure process that's totally cumbersome and takes years and years. So from city to city, state to state, you have real transparency issues around police accountability. And I know that unions have pushed back and said, no, if an officer is exonerated, that shouldn't be a public record. Right. And I'm saying, well, no, we should see that the officer was exonerated. That doesn't seem like a problem to me. And also we should see the quality of the investigation. Right. Be able to look and understand your government better. And I think that because law enforcement has so much power, there's a real meaning to be able to say, like, if something goes wrong, I'm going to actually see the work that was done toward accountability and potentially remedying the situation.
So, okay, well, first of all, we have one more proposal: truth and reconciliation. I think, I understand, but why did you want to put that as one of the important proposals?
So my experience as someone who's squarely not law enforcement, who sometimes has the confidence of law enforcement,
right,
is that there are a lot of cops who want to more genuinely talk about the work that they do. Mm-hmm. And in most of those instances, they're afraid they'll get in trouble for one reason or the other. Mm. Sometimes they're concerned about the police leadership. Sometimes that's a concern about the union or the rank and file. There are all these competing interests, but the central idea is somebody's going to get in trouble. And I think that there are many instances where giving folks amnesty is the way to move forward, because we, as John Timoney put it, what was it? Those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it, and those who study policing know we don't study history.
Right.
Right. That's a former deputy commissioner in the NYPD said that.
Wow.
And so I think to the greatest extent that we can have honest, candid conversations about what's going on, we'll have the greatest opportunity to actually fix these situations.
So your thing is, I want to be clear, because it could sound like you're saying the importance of truth and reconciliation is so that police officers can speak. And, for me, the first people to come to mind when I think about truth and reconciliation is the victims and survivors of police work. But some people would say police misconduct, whatever you want to say, police brutality. I mean, I think I just would say from a historical standpoint, looking at 6,000, however many pages it was of the Lexile Commission, and just seeing the testimony of all these people that has been completely forgotten.
It's intense. And
I'm like, it just has to. And then when you go through the 50A files, you quote a statistic in the book. You said, I don't know if it was in one particular year, 35,000 complaints received. 50% of them were thrown out or something.
Yeah, I don't remember that specific. I know it was, but there are many, many thousands of complaints.
The point is the thousands. Yeah. And my point is those experiences matter, because every one of those complaints was something that happened to a person, to me. And Anyway, so I think of that when I think of Truth and Reconciliation, but what I hear you saying is we can understand some details, though, about the problems in the system. There's some information that officers have. I'm not arguing that their own...
No, and that's right. We speak to that to a certain extent, right? There need to be spaces that elevate the voices of folks who've been impacted by police misconduct or even not misconduct, just harmful situations.
Right.
And that's critical. I think as somebody who also speaks to a lot of folks who've been victims of misconduct or family members of impacted folks, like that's a real hard choice to make, to speak out. I know folks who in high-profile situations have been close family members of people whose names we all know and who've been like, I don't want that to be my whole life. So I'm sensitive to that, at least.
Right. And then I mean, in an environment
where... It can be
where...
embarrassing, it can be challenging in so many different ways, it can be emotionally exhausting. We want to highlight the folks who want to speak about that.
Right. Let me just say this. Yeah. In an environment where also the system forms against you, because what Kristi Noem is doing right now, lying about Renee Good, is like that. Sadly, that also has happened at the local level, right? Like police, there's situations where they characterize a person in a certain way, a person who's already been, it's like another kind of character assassination that follows the actual killing. So in that context also, right, it's important to hear from the people who have been impacted. But you're saying yes to that, but also
equal parts. Like they show, there was in Baltimore Gun Trace Task Force that they did an HBO show about.
Right, exactly.
Cops planting guns, doing crimes. In that instance, one of the top recommendations by the DOJ Inspector General was to have the folks who committed the misconduct and went to jail come back and speak to officers and speak to the public about what they had done and how they had done it and what the impact was on them and the people they love and the people around them and the community. And that's a really missing piece of the puzzle. So I think that every community has a different story of how police misconduct has a chance of having really impacted it. I think about Oakland in that conversation. Oakland is a city that still does not really have conversations as a city, as a government entity, about the Black Panthers. That does not have a conversation about the people killed by the police during that time. Does not have a conversation about cops who were killed during that time. And you can feel this simmering resentment that's there, 50, 60 years later? There was never a real, like, hey, what happened here? Who died? Who's still hurt? And then you've got police misconduct cascading into the future, but never going back to that original source of after the Great Migration. You had a white police department in a suddenly black city and radical politics entering that, and lives were lost. And it's culturally what people know Oakland for. They're like, oh yeah, Black Panthers. Movie Black Panther starts there, right?
Right.
But we never really were like, what happened here?
Fruitvale Station. All the way to Fruitvale Station.
Yeah, it echoes out and out. And I think that every community has especially Black and brown communities, have like, what was our thing? And oftentimes open at questions about like, did we ever really go back and try to heal this in a meaningful, honest way? Or was it political situation, or did we sweep it under the rug? I think there are so many open-ended questions that creating a framework for truth and reconciliation is really important in any community.
Right.
And should just be on the mind of any politician who's involved.
I agree. I'm glad you put it in there. I mean, I think the truth has to be first. Sometimes folks try to skip to the reconciliation, but the truth got to come first, and that's going to be a lot of truth that has to come out. But I would appreciate the fact that that's in there. So I want to get into some more of the stories, because you're, just in talking with you, and one thing I think is really important for people to understand is that you were a CCRB investigator. I mean, so like you are not coming to this not having seen some of the horror show.
Oh yeah, I've seen a lot of tough stuff.
Impact and also systemic failure. So do you remember, can you give us, what was it like? Do you remember back what it was like when you started and going through the system, and what some of the lessons about police oversight specifically were?
Yeah, so I remember it clear as day walking in. I didn't expect to work at the CCRB for very long. I didn't expect to work in police accountability for very long. And I showed up at this office, still there, 100 Church Street, and near the World Trade Center. If you have a complaint against the NYPD, that's where to go. And you walk in, and it was like Office Space, the movie. I was like, this is a weird work environment. First thing, you're like,
Right.
it's a wide open floor and everybody's quiet. And it was just eerie. And I got escorted to my desk, and I remember being brought into training, and then suddenly you're being trained on police procedure. Mind you, almost everybody's under 30, which you would think would make more of a jubilant work environment on some level.
Right.
But it was very subdued. And, everybody's having serious conversations about police accountability and what their cases are, but it's not really ever really zooming out onto police accountability. It's like, what cases you working on? Oh, I got an interesting case at a mosque. I got an interesting case in Brownsville, in East New York, and South Bronx. And so that's the language becomes talk and shop about what are the cases that are going on. And I was just lucky that I got really exposed to the storytelling experience of that, of like really understanding your case was the goal as an investigator. You wanted to understand what happened from each person's perspective.
Right.
And you wanted to understand what had happened from the surveillance camera's perspective, and you needed to be able to elicit answers through effective questions to get people to give you clear information about what they saw and where they were and what was going on.
In terms of what you're able to talk about, can you remember a particularly instructive case that taught you a lot about how this whole thing works?
There's a lot of answers because there's a lot of problems and a lot of potential solutions. Which I mean, the first, I think. All right, I'll give you the first officer I interviewed.
Right.
So it's intense.
Okay, I'll brace myself.
Right,
listeners, brace yourselves,
because this is a weird experience for everybody. And once you're more tenured, you get somebody, you smack them up. This will be great. But as a civilian who's never been in the law enforcement universe, the first officer you interview, you're like sweating bullets. You're like, what am I going to ask? Am I going to get this right? And I remember I had
he's a whole officer, and you're like
he's a grown man,
you're like
right?
a kid.
Yeah, that's how it feels. I mean, I came in a little later. I worked in politics before this.
Right.
But, I've got the NYPD story. I'm like, this is the dude who would be on TV kind of thing. And suddenly I'm sitting there in an interview room that's 10 by 10 and fluorescent light coming down, and his attorney's looking at me like, who is this new kid? And yeah, he's a grown man who allegedly beat somebody up, and we don't have video footage. So my interview is going to be like the only thing that resolves this. And I remember going, am I going to get it right? And you come in with another investigator who's more tenured, and you ask a question like, so what happened here? And this particular officer was pretty cagey, which on and off, that'll happen. But he was like, well, I don't recall the specifics. And let's just say that's how your interview starts, and you're like, what do I do from here?
Right. So I'm the officer. So I don't recall the specifics.
No. And the first time I'm doing this, I'm looking over at the person next to me because I'm nervous.
Right.
And she's like, all right, start from the beginning.
Right.
Right. So you're in your car. How you're actually going to do? So you're in your car and you got a call, right? Yeah. What was the call? Tell me about it. And then, well, yeah, it was a 1085 officer in need of assistance. There was a car stopped. What else did you know about that? Did you get any other information about the call? Did you have any conversation with your partner about it? Okay, great. We got a general pool of information about beforehand. That probably isn't that relevant. All right, so you drove up to the scene. Tell me about that. And you really try to ask open-ended questions like that. Ultimately, that's the training, that you're going to ask broad questions, let them fill in the details, and then you get into it. And once people are asked open-ended questions, as you know, as an interviewer, like you're going to get a lot more information.
For sure.
That reflex, as you also know, is not built into everybody, especially if you're straight out of college. For a lot of the folks who work at the CCRB.
To learn how to question an interview.
So you build that
skill set. So do you remember what
time.
happened in this particular one, what the guy said?
So this is pretty crazy. In that incident, it was really bad vibes. And I remember walking out of the interview, and I was like, did I do all right? Yeah, we got all the information we needed. But there was a lingering question as to like what had happened, and had the officer used improper use of force. Scary situation when we had hair pulled out of a car and really roughed up. And somebody in the office who knew who that officer was just walks by and is like, you just interviewed that officer? And he's like, I'm going to give it 7 years till that officer kills somebody.
Whew.
And you're sitting there being like, what is this place? Now, he didn't. I look it up from time to time.
Not yet.
Because
that person is still working.
I'm like, as far as I'm aware. And I'm like, so maybe he got on the right path.
Right.
But
do you remember
do
you remember if that led to like a substantiated complaint?
It did not. It did not. We were never able to determine based on those interviews. And that's all pre-body cam. So in the book, we go through the sort of transition from this era where you've got somebody came in and said the officers beat me up, and they give you a detailed narrative ultimately of what that looks like. And then you're like, what happened to the officer? And you probably don't have any witness or video footage. The transition to body cam is severe, both in terms of the quality of evidence and also in terms of how you're approaching the case. Because suddenly you're going to see the body cam in some instances before you even talk to the victim.
Right.
And so that's going to frame the information you get. And then, as you mentioned before, there's an ongoing question in law enforcement of when does the officer see the body cam too?
I have tons of questions about body cams, but I want to stay on civilian review for a minute. So that would be a case where the thing that was being investigated is something that CCRB has the jurisdiction and authority to make substantiate the complaint and make recommendations. But there's also some things that officers might do or be guilty of that CCRB does not have the jurisdiction. Is that correct?
Yeah, let me break that down for a sec. So CCRB investigates 5 major categories of misconduct. So that's force, abuse of authority, which really think of that as like Fourth Amendment, stop and frisk, search and seizure issues, a search warrant into a house, discourtesies. So that's generally going to be just an officer cursing at somebody, and then offensive language, which is going to be racial slurs, generally racial gender-based slurs.
Right, hate language. Right.
And then you also have false statements. And that was a charter change relatively recently. So now they have that as well. And the CCRB makes recommendations once they do investigations into those specific categories to the police department on how to discipline an officer. Different process in other cities, because if you think about jurisdiction, like in some cities, you can investigate financial crimes, investigate DUIs, anything that could possibly be considered misconduct can be in that pool. If you make a false statement at a criminal trial, maybe that can enter something. So enter the conversation, have the oversight entity there. So it's a relatively limited pool. And you mentioned the Mullen Commission in the 90s. That was part of the debate. Is the CCRB going to investigate corruption? And ultimately the answer was no for an array of political reasons.
Wow.
But that would have been a real game changer in terms of the latitude of the work that they do. So force, abuse of authority, discourtesy, offensive language, and false statements is CCRB, but every other place is a little different. And so, if you're listening from somewhere other than New York City, it's always interesting to look at there's a civilian review board, is there a police commission, and if it does investigations, what exactly does it investigate? Because that's always a battleground in civilian oversight. Are you going to be able to expand to false statements or expand to criminal misconduct? Because in Chicago, where I would argue they have the most robust oversight in the country, if it is in Oakland, they're doing investigations into criminal misconduct. They're doing really, really broad categories of misconduct with a very large oversight agency. It's actually, I believe right now, bigger than the New York one. Even the Chicago Police Department is much smaller.
Which makes sense, because why should police officers be able to get away with things that are crimes?
Well, the idea is that those cases are investigated by internal affairs, right? When there's corruption.
Right.
And then you ask yourself, when they're in New York, for example, when the head of internal affairs is alleged to have been exchanging blowjobs for overtime, is that going to be the king of integrity? And so scandals in internal affairs tend to pop up, speaking to the broader argument about the quality of civilian oversight instead of internal affairs.
Wow. And then another interesting thing that I know you've looked at is how performance reviews come into this. So the way I understand this is if there's like a complaint against an officer and maybe let's just say the complaint is substantiated. Now, as part of this, or maybe as part of determining if the complaint is going to be substantiated, there might be someone might look at this person's performance. What are the patterns of how they've done their work up to this moment? And that might play into it. What's important about that for you when it comes to police oversight?
Yeah, so let's zoom out and imagine you have a performance evaluation at a corporation right now. A lot of that's going to even be AI driven or whatever.
Right, yeah, right.
You're going to get a survey about your coworker. Hey, how does this person to work with? Or that's going to be more cutting edge. You're going to have 360 supervisors, subordinates, all going to chime in, and you're going to get a sort of well-rounded perspective on this person.
Right.
The issue in policing is that sometimes it can just be your direct supervisor, old school, giving you an evaluation based on how much they like you.
Right.
So that's a problem. But the broader problem that we look at in the book is this trend where officers who are making more arrests and summonses, and we're really focusing back to the stop and frisk era, the datafication of policing, more stops is good.
Right.
Did you make a lawful arrest? If you made an unlawful arrest, is that being reflected on the performance evaluation? These are really sort of self-evident questions if you're looking at it from far away. But I think we saw an issue where there were officers who had huge complaint records at the CCRB. They were, in many cases, getting promoted. And when you looked at their arrest histories, there was a through line where they were making a ton of arrests and summonses and issuing a bunch of summonses at a way higher rate than the average officer in the NYPD, and appeared to be being rewarded for that despite committing misconduct and being a source of major hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in lawsuits.
Is it correct to say that in a way, some of the positive that was reflected in their performance review was actually what it was resulted from harmful practices or practices that we should at least be thinking really critically about, like arresting too many people?
It's stuff that needs to be critically analyzed, and our assessment was that there was just a raw data point. The more arrests you make, the better your performance evaluation is liable to look. Now, hey, right, there are hopefully more complex ways that are being looked at, that the performance evaluations are being looked at in the NYPD even now, but also because of its size. NYPD is a slow-moving institution. So for me, also looking back is like, why is that the metric? It goes back to the politicians, putting pressure on the police leadership to make them look better. Say, we've got a lower crime rate and we've got more arrests being made, more summonses being made, so I can go back out to the population and say, you feel safer because our officers are doing more. And I think both critical folks like yourself are asking, is more better, right? And I think also the cops on the street, my experience.
I mean, I'm critical folks like myself are saying more is worse.
Yeah. No, well,
but there are people who are really trying to hold it as a question. Yeah.
I mean, you're ahead of that, but I'll say like cops understand the difference between a good and a bad in arrest, and they also, I mean, one time in a city, I was talking to a lawyer who represented cops, and he was like, I used to have cops who just did false stops. They would put in fake names just so they could pad their numbers, right? And you're thinking about like,
wow, fake names.
Yeah, and let alone the folks, because they were like, well, they work in this one beat, and you're stopping the same two dudes, and you've got to make X number of stops a week or a quarter. And so once you've stopped those dudes for the sixth time, and they're like, listen, we're going to have a serious problem, like, well, maybe I'll start making fake names and go from there. I mean,
and that you combine that with, I just got to shout out Edwin Raymond's book, An Inconvenient Cop. He talked about what's going on in the subways. I mean, he described it so vividly. And, you know, here was a person who was a lieutenant, I think it was a cop for 15 years, some of that a lieutenant. And he's like, yeah, he pretty much was a scam, because by being in the subways, you could get access to all these people that if they hop the turnstile, you hope they have a record. But it was basically all about these numbers. And he really was like, it's not at all. It wasn't about, he didn't even describe it in terms of the presence of police to give people the feeling of safety. He's like, it's a numbers game about doing stuff that in the end of the day was actually impacting people's lives, because one story that he describes is how he was actually under such pressure to get a collar, which is the name they term for an arrest, that he was, when people didn't hop the turnstile, he sometimes found himself angry, which is, I think that's
he's
really,
like, I got to get these numbers.
I think that's profound to say, like, you have an officer who's actually mad when people don't give them an opportunity. Like that's the kind of incentive that you've put.
Yeah, that we've put, and
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
That's why I'm optimistic about a lot of these things. It's like we can change.
So by way of moving towards ICE, for individual people who want to feel like they can have some kind of like, they want to strengthen essentially accountability around police. Maybe they're not involved in this. They're not part of activist groups or people that are. I mean, from your standpoint, what do you think is the best thing that individuals can do, especially when we're sort of in this sort of emerging, sort of flowering fascist period where police are following orders that have nothing to do with anything legal and certainly not to do with people's due process or rights? I mean, what can individuals do?
Well, for me, the broader vision that we allude to in the book is that there needs to be federal oversight of law enforcement, both on a local level and of federal law enforcement. Right. We're suddenly seeing officers take brazenly unconstitutional actions, killing people in the street and going like, who's supposed to hold these people accountable? It's internal affairs for ICE, by the way. And so, and then it's like, how does that work? And it's like, that's not a very transparent system, right? You probably never get any of the records related to some of these investigations. And if you do, it's years later. So I think we all need to be asking ourselves like, okay, let's say that Congress gets taken by the Democrats, or the Democratic lawmakers going to have a vision of preventing this in the future, of having actual permanent accountability systems for federal law enforcement that are built out.
Now, at one point you had the process of consent decrees, but I think there's a lot of people who would argue that consent decrees weren't very effective, and then they have become political and are now removed. Trump has taken them away.
Yeah.
So how can a person then have faith in the federal government as the institution that's going to do that?
But I'm not talking about the federal government like the Department of Justice running oversight of federal law enforcement. You have an independent body, right? In the same way. So we've got civilian oversight boards of people who are not law enforcement, who assess the actions of law enforcement and determine, many of them, there are layers of lawyers throughout these organizations who say, are folks in your community behaving constitutionally? Those questions are not being asked by independent people in the government. You look at the defunding of the Inspector General's offices across the country, or at the federal level.
Right.
That's another layer of accountability that is disappearing from federal government. But we need to have separate from federal law enforcement civilian oversight of that, because you can and have it be built so that a president can't tear that away. Right?
Now, I mean, as someone who's worked in, with civilian review in Oakland and in here in New York, I mean, I encounter, especially because of the kind of work I do, I encounter all kinds of people who have experiences, really harmful experiences with police. I mean, one thing I hear you saying is, you think there should exist this federal independent agency.
Yeah, that's a long ways out, admittedly.
But, and people, I guess, should support that and ask that of politicians. But in terms of people's individual, or more like just things people feel is in their control, even in terms of getting accountability for things that have happened, what do you think? What kinds of things, basic things, do you think are important?
So your local elections matter. I was just talking to a friend who asked, like, what can I be doing right now? And it's like, know who your local elected official is and organize for the person you value most. I know it's like lame on some level to be like, get involved in government, but actually,
why does it matter more than people think?
Because all it takes, in whatever city you're in, all it takes is a majority on the city council a lot of the time to have really meaningful change to your system of government, right? And knowing what that system of government is a hassle sometimes, right? We don't get local civics anymore, but you got to take a second. You got to read a Wikipedia page, understand you have a strong mayor system in your local government. Is it a strong city manager? Is it a strong city council? And how many people is it going to take to have meaningful change there? And then go help out, do a phone bank. And I look at, like, even at the federal level, like the most valuable thing I think somebody can be doing right now is making sure the 2026 election creates a balance, something closer to a balance of power here in the United States, because, like, if that doesn't happen, we're just going to have more of this. And that is the bulwark, right? You got to get Congress back if you're going to have a president behaving outside of the law. But, like, actually investing in that, because it's so easy to get discouraged. But, like, for me, like, when an election comes, I go canvass. I look that up. I'll go door to door. I'll say, hey, I'm signing up for your thing.
Because you feel it really matters.
Yeah.
So let's change gear and talk about ICE for a minute. Now, one of the things I've noticed that has worried me a little bit is I'm glad to see mayors and governors in places like Minneapolis and Minnesota, in places like Chicago, in places like LA, speak out against ICE. I've said it before. I'm going to say it real quick. I think there's no world in which I think anyone should be calling this a law enforcement agency. Mm-hmm. The data that has come in has shown that largely they are, sort of attacking, incarcerating people who have not broken any laws. And for example, recently they sort of, detained a New York City Council staff person who was in the right process for lawful process of immigration. So they're not enforcing that law. Just to call them law enforcement for me is participating in their propaganda. But that aside, I'm happy to see these mayors and governors and a growing group of people talk about what's happening and complain and speak out and say you can't do this. What has worried me is that in some instances, the language that they do that with is like, our local police are enough. We don't need this federal force. Mm-hmm. And I feel that when they do that, I get what they're trying to do, but it's like I feel like they're also kind of saying, well, wait a minute, some of these problems are still taking place with the local police. Mm-hmm. And to sort of paint the local police as like this heroic force that was protecting the city and now the only problem is ICE. So how do we think about policing and ICE together? Like how would you describe the ways in which some of the problems of ICE actually are continuous or related to problems in policing? How do we think about ICE as a policing problem?
Well, it's challenging because they're acting as a military force on some level, right? ICE is going out and scaring people, right? That's what's different. Like Obama and Clinton, they deported a ton of people. They weren't out there, as far as I'm aware. Hey, Bush too, out there going in and like intentionally taking unconstitutional action and being like, nanner, we can do this, right? That's pretty horrifying for the prospects of our like democracy continuing. Mm-hmm. If you got a military function that's responsible, the executive is just controlling and going around and messing with people in states like Minnesota, where we just know there's beef between the governor and the president,
which is part of what explains this tremendous escalation there. Then
I think that when I look at the Renee Good situation, though, from me, I say, okay, so let's look at all these failures of accountability. First of all, you have the Secretary for Homeland Security going out and just being like, well, he was defending himself. I'm like, Mr. Press, can somebody ask, did she talk to this officer? He go out and make a statement?
Yeah, how do you know? What is this based on? What investigation?
Because if so, I need that admitted in court. We got to have conversations about that statement. So are you making up what that is? Or did he talk to somebody? Is there some statement floating around? All right, so that's like, I mean, I'm just imagining if I came out and there was a shooting in Oakland and I'd been like, oh, the officer was defending himself, or that was wrong without having any sense of what had occurred, I'd be like, all right, so you got a major failure of just good government stuff there, and we're beyond that. But so then on top of that, you've got this like weird thing going on. You've got Trump being like he was almost killed, or you got Musk being like he's almost killed. Right? We don't see that on the video, but at the same time, we've got to be asking ourselves, like, what would be the ideal scenario, right? The ideal scenario in that, what unfortunate, it ends up being a law enforcement encounter or whatever. If we view it as if that was the Minneapolis Police Department, you would want folks to come on scene. You'd want them to gather the evidence. My understanding is they drove the car out of the state before investigators could do a ballistic investigation on the car in the good situation.
Yeah, I know they were intervening with that state investigative process.
Yeah, and you want people who are free from conflict of interest coming in, saying we're going to do an investigation, we're going to sequester the officer, make sure that officer gets legal counsel and that is questioned, and that you do a full assessment, you gather all the witnesses, right? Who knows if that was happening, right? And we've got these various video angles that are not even giving us like a perfect picture of that. So you're getting all the witnesses, you're going and gathering all the video, and somebody who has no interest in whether or not that was misconduct, but who just wants justice and wants an accurate portrait of the information to be painted, to sit down and go, all right, what really took place here? Then you interview the officer provides whatever defense they have, but also you're doing it in the open-ended sense. And I know it takes, even looking at this, it takes discipline, because you look at that and you want to go like, that's murder. But I'm like, I would love to sit in front of that officer and be like, tell me about what happened here. And because that is an important part of the process. Every officer, I think, has the opportunity should have the opportunity to go, what happened here? Now, maybe there'll be a criminal trial. Maybe the officer will go to another country or whatever.
I mean, from my standpoint, I feel like I know what happened.
Yeah.
But I also take the standpoint that investigations are important. Data is important. Everything is not always what it looks like. But that's all the more reason why, as you said before, it's really clear that these people on the federal level who have sort of almost operating like a case closed situation as bullshit. Because how could you have even known?
Well, and then let's say that the officer's justifications are not rational, and you need that case to go. That you have an agency that's staffed with people who can close that case in a timely fashion, filling all the due process needs, and then the officer is filed, and then they're fired, and they're put on criminal trial, and then you can go back to the community healing. Right? We're not going to get that here, right? But every time I see a tragedy, I'm like, all right, what would be the ideal situation of how this works? And I do think that it's a reminder that this could happen in a lot of places around the country from local law enforcement. It does happen from time to time. It happens at least 1,000 times a year that somebody's killed by the police in the United States.
So in a way, what I hear you saying is when we look at actually the problem, I mean, to me, the problem with ICE, right, in a way, is its existence. Let's just start there, and some of the sort of whole story about borders that underwrites it, and sort of like national, like that. To me, those are some of the deeper rooted problems. But taking for now that this whatever you want to call it force, the deportation force, paramilitary force, I've heard some people say exists. What I hear you saying is that the inability to hold it accountable is also, you can look at that and say some of those same things are related to the inability to hold regular police departments accountable.
Yeah, and if we had real accountability across the country in police departments, and it happens at varying levels, but if we had that, I think we'd be immediately identifying that as a central issue here and actually like pushing for system change. I mean, that's just what I believe in, and it's a luxury on some level. Like, I didn't lose my family here, but at the same time, it's like, all right, what's the vision for how to prevent this ever from happening again? And what does that legislation look like, and what does it take to build the momentum for that? Because a big part of this book is born from the frustration that after George Floyd, the movement came, but the solutions didn't.
That's right.
And so hopefully this is a step in the right direction.
100%. No, I really appreciate it.
Appreciate
listen,
you.
One thing I really appreciate about one thing I think that we have to do, those of us who want to get to justice, those who want to sort of get to democracy and make democracy more robust under these conditions, is we have to be able to have difficult conversations and move into the areas that we don't all see eye to eye on. And I just appreciate that you're someone who's been involved in trying to make change in the with some of the areas that are tangible, and you're willing to entertain as I'm bringing up some of these views that might counter some of your work. But I just learned so much from your book and from what you've said here, and I think we all really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, Chenjerai.
All right. Yo, give it up for Mac Muir. The book is called Cop, Breaking the Fixed System of American Policing by Mac Muir and Greg Finch. Don't want to forget about Greg. And yeah, y'all, hopefully we'll have Mac back on. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
What's up, unruly subjects? I hope you got something out of that conversation. It's one of many conversations we'll have on the topic of police. And before we close out the episode, I just want to offer you something. It's a lot going on right now. It's a very stressful time. And I just wanted to offer you a piece of music by my friend, A.D. Carson. Dr. A.D. Carson is one of the most talented artists I know. He's one of the most well-read people I know. He's a professor at UVA and just, a scholar of culture, literature, and sound. And he's one of the people who's really helped me to deepen my own practice of listening to and making music as almost like a therapeutic way to help make sense of the world. And so I'm going to play this song that's called In Hell and it's off of an album called Talking to Ghosts. And yeah, I actually called him up to explain the context because it's really deep and personal context behind this song and really the whole album. So here's AD talking about what was going on when he made this.
I mean, it's wild because everything was heavy. I thought things were bad. I recorded an album right before the pandemic. And then, like pandemic hits, folks are dying, like there's political unrest all across the country. And I start having panic attacks, but I don't even know that I'm having panic attacks. I'm literally thinking something is wrong with me. And so I end up making this album that's really like about breathing. And so like there's literally samples of breathing on the album and like, a breathing exercise like interrupts the joint somewhere in there. But it was something that I had to do. If there's ever a time that I made an album that I needed to make, it was Talking to Ghosts. Some of those others are things that were occasioned by things external to me. But like this one was me sitting at home all by myself, trying to reckon with the fact that we were locked in and folks couldn't move. And I literally, was having trouble breathing.
ADthegreat.com.
Yes.
So here's the song. We're going to go out on this song. His newest album is called Illicit. It's in the show notes. And he also has a new book out called Dope. So we're going to put all those links in the show notes so you can check out his work. His work is really something that is instructive and kind of like uplifting and really important. And of course, we're going to have my man on for a full, real interview because you're going to be blown away by what you learn from him. All right, y'all.
Held me, told me that I shouldn't go, but if I do it's something she would like for me to know. It's likely due to no fault of her own that I am prone, laying in the snow color of roses on my phone. Posits my deposit or my knowledge of the product is why she now is caught up in the logic of my calling. Coughing and I'm carrying the Mary that she's Helen, telling me to breathe between the squeezes, but I'm failing. Felt I was invincible in places that I'm from. I heard when people say the youth was wasted on the young, and here I am with sense to do equations, how I've come to this being the way that I would pay my final sum. Total shock to me that prophecy would say this wasn't odd, but we can only seem to see the problem properly through eyes that we are not inhabiting. So while she's grabbing on my hands and kissing me and reminiscing, we at last are making plans. A dance the devil loves to do, a bargain that's too good to pass it up. No matter what the consequences that you could see happen, us could never be us, we could never be. I'm fading and she's begging me to breathe.
Unruly Subjects is supported by listeners just like you. Join us at unrulysubjectspodcast.com. Unruly Subjects is produced in partnership with Row Home Productions. Boy, I'm proud of Row Home, you know what I mean? Alex Lewis is Row Home's creative director. John Myers is Row Home's executive producer. Shout out to my wife, Sadaka. Shout out to my daughter, Yola. Shout out to my assistant, Carissa. And thanks to Mac Muir for coming out talking to us, you know what I'm saying? Yeah, thanks, Mac. He's the co-author of Cop, Breaking the Fixed System of American Policing, along with Greg Finch. So you probably want to go pick that up. Also, thanks to Nurse Kim Mullen, you know what I mean? Yeah. I really want y'all to hear my whole interview with Nurse Mullen, so go to patreon.com/unrulysubjects. You can check it out. We also posted the report by her union over there. It's called Profits Over Patients. So you definitely want to see that. Our theme music was composed by Axel Kakutier, but the instrumental you're listening to right now was produced by Marcus Truth Fitzgerald. Shout out to Truth, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Alex Tatusian made our tile art. Yo, you got something to tell us? Call the Unruly Hotline, 215-436-9212. You can also text us at 215-436-9212. And make sure you subscribe to Unruly Subjects wherever you get podcasts. You can also follow the show on Instagram at Unruly Subjects Pod. I'm starting to do more there. And you can follow my personal Instagram at Chenjerai. And yo, if you haven't heard last week's episode about general strikes, you definitely want to go back and check that. It's with veteran labor organizer and strategist Bill Fletcher Jr. We get into like what people mean when they say general strike, how strike power is different from other kinds of protest power, and what kind of conditions actually have to exist for this kind of action to succeed, especially in a moment when repression is this real. So you definitely want to check that out. We'll see y'all next week.
Inhale, exhale, deep breaths, niggas, let your chest swell. Think I'm alive, I can't tell. Even if I'm breathing in hell. Exhale.
Rohome Productions. Unruly Subjects is supported by listeners just like you. Join us at patreon.com/unrulysubjects.